بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله حمدا كثيرا طيبا مباركا فيه كما يحب ربنا ويرضى والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. Alhamdulillah. Thank you for your patience with our technical difficulties. And as you notice, there are no slides on the board. So if you will kindly refer to the slides that we sent in the WhatsApp group. And for those of you who do not have those slides at hand, you can look at the slides with you. They're on the website as well, right? So these are the slides we're using. You can just follow along with them. So, Alhamdulillah, last week we introduced Module 5, which is one of the more important modules, and they're all important because they cover the things that we have to know as Muslims. But Module 5 is very important because it concerns something that is an obligation upon us every single day until the day we die. And that is the 5 daily prayers. And last week we talked about the virtues, the unique properties and effects of the prayer, as well as the severe warnings mentioned in the Quran and the Sunnah for neglecting prayer and leaving prayer out of laziness. In today's class, we're starting with the actual fiqh of Salat, the individually obligatory knowledge that every Muslim must have pertaining to Salat. And when we begin with learning about Salat, we're not saying that no one knows how to pray, but there's little things here and there that people often either don't know or they forget about. And this is why our teachers always recommend that even after you've learned this material, you should review it every 6 months to a year. If it's in a book form and you've studied it with a teacher, just read through the book. Look through your notes. Do that every 6 months to a year to refresh your memory on the details so that these things are fresh in your mind. So tonight, inshallah, we're going to cover the first things discussed in the books of fiqh about Salat. Usually in the books of fiqh, they begin with talking about 3 things. They talk first about the conditions that make the Salat obligatory. Then they talk about the causes that make prayer obligatory. And they talk then about the timing of the prayers. The first 2 are rather quick and easy to cover. The rest of the class is really about the third thing, the timings of the prayers. And what this means is we're learning more about the timings of the prayer so that we're not relying just on our prayer time apps, that we're able to actually know the times without the aid of these instruments. So without further ado, let's look at the conditions that obligate the prayer. The shurut of the wujub, the shurutu wujub as-salat, the conditions that make the prayer obligatory. You could put this in a question, and the question is, what are those things that must be in place before salat becomes an obligation on anyone? And the fuqaha mentioned 3 conditions, very simple. The first condition, they say, is Islam, which means that a person who is not a Muslim yet is not subject to the Salat. Only when they embrace Islam does the obligation of Salat apply to them. This means that if a person becomes a Muslim right here and right now, we would tell them, after congratulating them, to go take the ghusl, and we have the ghusl facility, and then when Isha comes in, that Isha would be obligatory on them. The prior Maghrib would not, because they weren't Muslim at the time. That's the first condition, is Islam. The second condition for the obligation of Salat is bulugh, or maturity. A child is not subject to the obligation of prayer until they attain the age of maturity. So basically, puberty, identified through various signs, and if there are no signs, then there's a difference of opinion among the fuqaha. Some say at 15, some say 18. But the general signs of puberty, when those signs are present, it is at that moment that salat is wajib on that person because they are mukallaf, they are legally responsible. As a legally responsible person, having reached the age of maturity, they are responsible for praying and they are sinful if they do not pray. That doesn't mean that younger children are not instructed to pray. So we want to make some clarification here. The Prophet ﷺ said to instruct your children to pray at 7. Tell them, encourage them gently, and then you discipline them once they reach the age of 10 if they neglect the prayer. So what that means, to be more precise, bulugh here could mean the age of maturity where salat is the obligation, but they're still told to pray before they hit puberty. But at 10 they're disciplined, and prior to 10 they're just encouraged without the discipline. So if a child doesn't pray, a 5-year-old, a 6-year-old doesn't pray, then there's no sin on them because the salat is not yet wajib on them because they have not attained the age of bulugh. And lastly, a condition for the obligation of prayer is sanity. And this al-aql, which means that a person who is insane, lacking in their mental faculty to the point of being insane, salah is not obligatory on them. In that moment, right? There's details about when they come out of that and what they're supposed to do, but in the moment it's not obligatory. So this means that you're a Muslim, you've reached the age of maturity and you're sane, then prayer is an obligation on you. These are the shurut of wujub, the conditions of obligation. You then come to the asbab wujud, or the causes that obligate the prayer. So basically, what are those causes that when in place, prayer becomes obligatory? Well, there's just one. And that is the entering of the time. Dukhulul waqt. When the time of the prayer enters, that is when the prayer is obligatory. So let us look at Fajr for July 23rd, 2022. July 23rd, 2022. Is that Fajr obligatory on us right now? No. Why? Because the cause is absent, and the cause is it entering the time. So at 3:30 a.m. on July 23rd, is Fajr obligatory? No, because it's 3:30 in the morning. Fajr has not yet entered. Let's say it's 5 in the morning. Is it obligatory? Yes, now it is. So on July 23rd at 5 or so in the morning, that Fajr will be obligatory because the sabab, the cause of its obligation, has appeared, which is dukhulul waqt, the entering of the time. So this goes back to an important point we were touching on last week. Last week we were talking about the virtues and the effects and qualities of prayer and the warning against neglecting it. And we recited the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Al-Ma'un, فَوَيْنٌ لِلْمُصَلِّينَ الَّذِينَ هُمْ عَنْ صَلَاتِهِمْ سَاهُونَ. Allah says, woe unto those who pray. Who remembers what the meaning of woe is? According to the tafsir of Ibn Abbas, what does wail or woe mean? Anyone recall? Jahannam, to be more precise, a valley in Jahannam. Wadin fi Jahannam. So Allah Ta'ala is saying, woe or hellfire awaits those who pray. But you have to read the next verse to get the full understanding. Not those who pray in general, but specific people. الَّذِينَ هُمْ عَنْ صَلَاتِهِمْ سَاهُونَ. Those who are neglectful of their prayer. Now this word sahun has a variety of meanings in the Arabic language. You could legitimately translate sahun as those who are negligent, those who are not mindful, those who are distracted from the prayer. And that can even apply to someone in the prayer being absent-minded. And this is how some of the tabi'un had understood the verse. We mentioned the narration from Mustahab, the son of Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas radiyallahu anhu. He recited this verse and was very worried. He said to his father, Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas, who among us does not have internal dialogue when they're in prayer? Who among us doesn't have that internal conversation, thinking about this and that while in prayer? He thought that that's what the verse meant. And Sayyiduna Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas radiyallahu anhu corrected him. He said the meaning of this verse is applied to a person who, when the time of the prayer comes, they're negligent of it, they're not paying attention, they're engaged in some idle pastime all the way until the time leaves. So the entering of the time is significant because it's not for us to choose when to pray. When we do have some wiggle room depending on the prayer and the time left, but it's not our choice to say, I'm going to pray 5 times a day, but I'm busy today, so I'm going to hold off and pray. I'll pray Fajr at home because I'm up before I go to work, but I'm busy all day, so I'm going to pray Dhuhr, Asr, and Maghrib all together with Isha when I get home. That's not a choice that we're allowed to make as Muslims. To do that is sinful because it means the person has missed those prayers. And whatever they're praying at the end of the night is actually qada, it's makeup. It's not fulfilling the prayer in its actual time. Imam al-Ghazali talks about this a little bit in his Ihya Ulumuddin as well as his Munqidh min al-Dalal, when he talks about the significance of the times of prayers as well as the number of rak'ahs in each of the prayers. And he uses the analogy of medicine. When a doctor, a skilled professional doctor who really knows his science, when he prescribes a medicine, he knows exactly what to prescribe, how much to prescribe, and when to take it. So imagine a doctor gives you a bottle of pills, something very important for your health, and you're supposed to take one in the morning, one in the afternoon, one in the late noon, early evening, one at sunset, and one in evening. And you say, if one in the morning is good and one in the afternoon is good, I'm sure all 5 will be just fine in the evening. I'll just take them all at once because I'm having a busy day. What do you think is going to happen to the person if they take this medication 5 doses all at once at the end of the day? Do you think it's going to harm them? It probably will because they're taking too many. So Allah Ta'ala prescribed these 5 prayers in certain times for wisdoms that He knows. That's for our benefit. The basic idea is every aspect of our day is punctuated with remembrance of Allah, so that ideally we organize our life around the prayer instead of organizing our prayer around our life, which is sometimes unavoidable in certain circumstances. So the basis of this is in the words of the Quran. In Surah An-Nisa, Allah tells us, إِنَّ الصَّلَاةَ كَانَتْ عَلَى الْمُؤْمِنِينَ كِتَابًا مَوْقُوتًا. He says, indeed, the prayer has been prescribed at appointed times for the believers. So we don't get to make the choice of when to pray Fajr. We can't choose to pray Fajr at Dhuhr time when we are able to get up and pray. We don't purposely delay these things in that manner. Because the prayers have very specific times, and that prayer time has to come in before its obligation, we need to know what the times of the prayers are. Most people are using these prayer apps, and that's fine, but I want to talk a little bit about how they work and some of the discrepancies on them that you may find, and how to make sense of that, given our own location and the climate that we have here in this region in particular. So let's present the times of the prayers, when they enter and when they end, according to the school of Imam Abu Hanifah rahimahullah ta'ala. So looking at the slides, we see the slide that has the 5 prayers pictured with the arrows pointing to each of them. So we have these 5 prayers. We have Fajr, Dhuhr, Asr, Maghrib, and Isha. And this is the simplest way of explaining when they begin and when they end. And we say Fajr enters when you have the entrance of the true dawn, Al-Fajr al-Sadiq, until right before sunrise. This is an overview. We're going to look at these individually once we finish this. Dhuhr is immediately after midday until the time when a shadow of an object is twice its length. Asr is from the aforementioned point until right before sunset. In other words, the end time of Dhuhr marks the beginning of Asr. Maghrib is from sunset until the disappearance of the red twilight, Ash-Shafaq al-Ahmar. And Isha, and Witr is included here, is from the aforementioned point until right before Fajr. So basically, after the disappearance of the red twilight until right before Fajr. So Isha is quite a large window. So these are the basic times, but let's look at them individually to get a better understanding. Looking at Fajr. Now, you either have 2 scenarios here. You are either praying Fajr in the masjid or you're praying it at home. If you're praying it at home, if you're like most people, you're not setting the alarm for the moment the prayer time enters. You're putting it back a little bit to get that extra sleep. But you're giving yourself a nice cushion so you're not missing the prayer. So technically, if that's what you're doing and you're getting up, you don't have to worry about praying too early. However, we should still know when Fajr enters and how to recognize it. And so the fuqaha say that Fajr begins at true dawn and enters just before sunrise. When you say true dawn, what does that imply? It implies that there's a false one. And there is. We call it Al-Fajr al-Sadiq, the true dawn, and Al-Fajr al-Kadhib, the false dawn. The true dawn is when the sky around the horizon begins to increase in light. So you'd have to go outside on a day where there's no cloud coverage to see this. And even here, I don't know if it's even possible here, given the heights. You'd have to find a place where you can get a good elevation. But let's say you're on a flat surface, you can see on the horizon the light that is distributed horizontally, that white light. This is the Fajr Sadiq, the true Fajr. Before that spreads horizontally, you have this dim light that sometimes appears overhead for a few minutes, followed by darkness. This is called the false Fajr. And this would only be recognized if you go out really early before Fajr comes in and you see that change. So really for us, it's not making much of a difference in our daily life to know this distinction, except if you were up all night and you wanted to know if it's Fajr. Don't let the first appearance of any light deceive you in thinking that it's Fajr. You need to wait for that light to distribute on the horizon. This is the true Fajr. Now the difference between the false and the true dawn, it's said to be 3 degrees. So that's about 12 minutes, which means these are not major time periods. If you see that, wait about 10 to 12 minutes, and then usually you'll see that light appear across the horizon. And it all depends on where you are, the latitude, your location. So this is just a basic guideline. It's not a hard and fast rule for every location. But it's good to go outside and catch the difference between the false dawn and the true dawn, especially for fasting, because, well, as we learned, you are allowed to eat and drink up until a certain point, and you need to know that. So if you have your phone with you, maybe you can open it up to your Prayer Time app. Most of you have that Muslim Pro, correct?
Yeah.
Right? Most people have that. I don't have that myself. I use iPray, the lowercase I. So if you go to that one or to Muslim Pro, if you go to settings, you'll find in the settings the calculation method. You can click on the calculation method and you'll find this list. The list will give you different options to choose from, and that will affect the time of these prayers. So I have here on mine ISNA, North America, Muslim World League, Al Qura, UAE, Egyptian General Authority, the Islamic University of Karachi, the Geophysics University of Tehran, and another one says custom. So you can customize it. So I want us to look at, when I was putting these notes together, I was looking up the Fajr time for the next day. So this may not be entirely accurate right now, but just to demonstrate this. Using each of these, according to the ISNA model, Fajr time comes in at 4:26 in the morning. Using the Muslim World League, it comes in at 4:02. That's a significant difference, affecting both prayer and fasting. Al Qura calendar or timetable has Fajr coming in at 3:58 a.m. The Egyptian General Authority has it coming in at 3:49, and lastly, the Islamic University of Karachi has it coming in at 4:02, which is like the Muslim World League. So, what gives? Well, they are using different ways of calculating. Some are using 18 degrees, some are using 15 degrees. The Al Qura is using 19 degrees, and the Egyptian General Authority is using 19.5. This is obviously going to affect the beginning times for Fajr specifically. So what do? There are a lot of robust discussions among the ulama about 15 versus 18 degrees, or should you calculate in between, or should you just look locally and make the adjustments as needed. To really cut to the chase and get to the essence of this, you should basically choose a time, an approximate time for each region, and understand that none of these timetables are going to be 100% precise, because a timetable cannot be universally applied in this manner, applying to every single region despite its latitude and atmospheric conditions. It's just not possible. So you can use one of these and adjust as needed based on your own local observations. If you observe any differences between what you're seeing in the prayer times and what's in the prayer app, it's not likely to be that often. You may not ever see a change, but this is one of the ways. Now, the method that I prefer, and that of many teachers, is the 15 degree, because it's in a middle point between 12 and 18, and that's usually the range for Fajr in most places on the earth. If you go around the world and look for when Fajr comes in, it's in that general range. So if you go with 15, you're more or less safe. And if you're using the 15 degree calculation for Fajr and Isha, it's useful to look outside and pay attention to see if there's any discrepancies between the calculation that you're going by on the app and what you're seeing with your eye. It's useful to do that, but it's very unlikely that you're going to see anything. because most of us living in cities cannot see in a way that would give us that kind of clarity. Therefore, you can trust the apps. However, it's good to get used to learning how to judge the time of the prayer outside, so that if there's any discrepancy, you know what's going on. So if you go with the ISNA one, which is 15 degrees, you're good to go. You don't have to really worry. Some people try to go with varying between 15 and 18, where they pray according to the 15 degrees and they fast according to the 18 degrees, because they say, well, because there's the discrepancy, I want to be on the safe side. I don't want to pray Fajr before it comes in, but I don't want to be eating when Fajr has entered. But I don't think this approach is wise, because the entering of the time of Fajr is the cause for the obligation of prayer as well as fasting. So to separate between the two in this arbitrary manner, it's not robust. It's not a robust way of doing things. And though a person may think it's a cautious way, our fiqh is not based just on being cautious, it's based on being accurate. So the end of all this is, if you have your prayer calculator here and it's set for ISNA, you're good to go more or less, don't worry. But you should learn how to measure the times of prayer without the apps, without the papers, without any of these things, because those are attempts to measure the entering of the times, which are the causes for the obligation of prayer. But the actual cause for the obligation occurs outside, on the horizon. So you should connect yourself with nature by knowing how that works. So that, okay, let's say your phone dies and you don't have a prayer timetable with you and you're out somewhere. You want to know, what has Dhuhr come in? Has Asr come in? How much time do you have before Maghrib? What's going on? If you're completely unfamiliar with how that works, it's going to be strange and you won't know what to do. So Fajr we've covered. We now come to Dhuhr. This kind of class is best done outside on a sunny day, where we have teaching aids such as sticks that we can stick into the ground, and with shadows that we can observe in movement, because that's basically how you determine the entering of these times and the exits of these times. Dhuhr begins after the sun's zenith at midday, and it's going to end when the shadow of the upright object is twice as long. So let's imagine you have a stick, we plant it into the ground, it's standing aright. You stick that into the ground and note its shadow. If that shadow continues to get shorter bit by bit, it's not Dhuhr. You watch it shorten. Once it stops to shorten, that's when it's midday. And you'll notice that that corresponds to the sun being at the zenith, right? That's actually a prohibited time of prayer. You can't pray during that time. So when the shadow stops, the sun is midday. Once that shadow begins to lengthen, the time of Dhuhr has entered. This is a good homework assignment. It's a nice, beautiful summer out there. You should go home, go out tomorrow, take a stick, put it in the ground, and observe it at around 1 o'clock. And watch the shadow get shorter and shorter. Watch it stop for about 6 to 7 minutes, maybe less, and then watch it start to lengthen. You are watching the sun reach the zenith and then enter Dhuhr time. That is how you determine the entering of Dhuhr. Now, most people are not doing that, obviously. They're waiting for the adhan or the beep to go off on their phone, and they say, okay, it's Dhuhr now. But this is how you do it, using the sun and observing the shadow. Now, going back to this, if Dhuhr enters as soon as the shadow begins to move, as it begins to grow and lengthen, when does it end? it ends when the shadow of that object is twice as long. So let's say you have a stick planted in the ground that is 1 foot long. Once the shadow is 2 feet long, you have now entered Asr time. That's it. So once the shadow of the upright object is twice as long, Dhuhr is done and Asr has begun, according to one view. There's two views in the school. We'll talk about that. The Hanafi Asr. If you ever wondered why they pray Asr so late in some masajid, we're going to answer that, inshallah. So, Asr begins when the shadow of the upright object is twice as long. But when does it end? It ends right before sunset, when the disk of the sun is completely below the horizon. If you can still see the disk of the sun right at the tip of the horizon, to pray Asr at that time purposely is sinful, but Maghrib hasn't yet begun. Once it goes beneath the horizon and the disk disappears, when it's completely below the horizon, this marks the entrance of Maghrib. Asr is over. So, you'll notice, and I remember this when I went to Pakistan to visit in 1996. It was my first time ever experiencing this, that I would hear the adhan for Asr in one masjid, and then I would hear the adhan for Asr much later at the majority of the masajid. And I always wondered what was going on there. You know, I was a young man, and I asked, and it was explained to me, well, it's because of the difference of opinion about the Asr time. So a few masajid took one view, and the majority of the masajid took the other view. What's that all about? There are many masajid in North America where you'll notice that there's a discrepancy between its Asr time and that of other masajid in the same city. One is much later than others. And there's a reason for that. And there's no harm in either view. Both views are completely valid, but it's helpful to understand what's that all about and where it comes from. And to answer this, in the school of Imam Abu Hanifah, there is an internal disagreement about the end of Dhuhr. Because at the end of Dhuhr, you have the beginning of Asr. So according to the view of Imam Abu Hanifah himself, Dhuhr ends, and therefore Asr begins, when the shadow of an upright object is twice its length. So if you have a 1 foot stick, the shadow will be 2 feet. That's Asr, according to Imam Abu Hanifah. Now, the views of his two main students, who were mujtahids in their own right, Imam Abu Yusuf and Muhammad bin Hassan, rahimahumullah, their opinion is that Dhuhr ends, and therefore Asr begins, when the shadow of the upright object is equivalent to its own length. It's quite a difference. So according to these two Imams, if the stick is, you have the stick, 1 foot long stick in the ground, once the shadow is equal, 1 foot, that marks the end of Dhuhr and the beginning of Asr. So that is also a view within the school. And you have in the school of Imam Abu Hanifa, great mujtahid Imams who preferred the view of the Imam himself, Imam Abu Hanifa, and then those who preferred the view of Imam Abu Yusuf and Muhammad bin Hassan. And the view of Imam Abu Yusuf and Muhammad bin Hassan is the same view as Imam Shafi'i, Imam Malik, and Imam Ahmad. So that view is consistent with the other three legal schools that we study. So what you have are two valid views. They both have their proofs and their reasonings. So if you are in a place where they pray Asr a little later, that's completely fine. And if you are praying Asr later but happen to be at a masjid that prays it at the earlier time according to the other view, that's also valid. Your prayer is valid, even though according to one Imam it's not yet Asr, because our job is not to settle these differences of opinion. It is to follow qualified scholarship in areas of legitimate differences of opinion. And it's a legitimate difference. So if this is something you want to do, if you want to follow this, you can follow this. You want to follow that, you can follow that. And one advice I have given to people is to consider following the view of Imam Abu Hanifa about Asr, particularly in the winter time in these regions. Why? Because you'll notice that in the winter time, there's a very short space of time between Dhuhr and Asr. And it's very easy for a person to get caught up when Dhuhr comes in and miss Dhuhr and Asr comes in. But if you take the view of Imam Abu Hanifa, where the Asr starts a bit later, you give yourself a bigger window to pray the Dhuhr in the Dhuhr time before Asr. And this is one way to be consistent in your obedience to Allah and praying on time in times of need. So these are two valid views. So when the sun disappears, it goes below the horizon, what prayer enters? Maghrib. So you're now at Maghrib. So in the school of Imam Abu Hanifa, according to the Muftabihi, the official position on which fatwa is given in the school, Maghrib begins at sunset until the disappearance of the red twilight, what they call Ashafaqul Ahmar. When that red twilight disappears, Isha begins. That is the official position on which fatwa is given. However, you have a position from Imam Abu Hanifa himself, which says that Maghrib ends with the disappearance of the white twilight after sunset. You know, if you observe Maghrib time and watch how it transforms into Isha, you'll see how this red twilight appears for a time, and then there comes this white twilight. To understand these differences, you need to connect yourself with the patterns of creation and observe that change from the red twilight to the white twilight. So the official position is that once you have the disappearance of the red twilight, you have the beginning of Isha, the end of Maghrib. So that's according to the majority view within the school. The position of Imam Abu Hanifa is different. It mentions the white twilight, which is also going to affect the view on when Isha comes in. So let's say that the red twilight has disappeared and Isha time has entered. And it's actually entering, for us, it's entering in about 20 something minutes. Once Isha enters, when does it end? Before Fajr comes in. So it basically ends right before Fajr. Does that mean that you should just go to sleep, pray Maghrib and go to sleep and then wake up at 3:45 and pray Isha and then wait for Fajr? No, you shouldn't. Ideally, you pray Isha and then go to sleep, right? But this is the time you have. It's not recommended to pray that far back, but that's the amount of time one would have. Now, this is mentioning the basic signs of when these times enter and when they leave. When should you pray ideally within each of those prayer times? When the adhan goes off, does that mean you must, on your phone, or when the prayer time enters, does that mean you should just jump up right away and go make wudu and pray? Maybe, but not necessarily. So there are certain times for each of these prayers where it's recommended to pray, and there are other times where it's discouraged to pray. So looking at Fajr, when is it recommended to pray Fajr? As soon as the adhan goes off on your alarm clock, as soon as the time enters? No. Not for men, at least. According to the Hanafi school, for men, it's actually recommended to wait a little while until there's a bit of brightness on the horizon before Fajr ends. And for women, it's recommended that they pray Fajr at the earlier period. What's that about? It's based on the idea that men will probably be going to pray the Salat in Jama'ah, and so you give people more time to prepare for the prayer, to get up, to freshen up, make wudu, get dressed, walk out the door, walk, or in this case, drive to the masjid and enter. So by delaying the Fajr for the men, it's enabling more people to go to the Jama'ah. How late? The ulama say it should be ideally in a time where if you prayed Fajr and you realized after the prayer that you didn't have full tahara, or you had al-hadath al-akbar and you had to take a ghusl, you would have enough time to go and take the ghusl and pray Fajr over again at the same speed you were praying it earlier. So that amount of time, however long that is. So the idea is you're delaying it a bit so that everyone or more people can go to the masjid for Jama'ah. And this is why it's recommended for men to delay it somewhat, according to that reasoning. And for women, it's because ideally they're praying at home and you pray it in its earlier time. This is seen as recommended, mustahab. When we come to dhuhr, they say that it's recommended to pray dhuhr in the summertime when the weather becomes cooler. So if dhuhr enters at 1:20 and it's hot outside, and you know that at 2:30 or even 3 it's going to cool down, you can pray it then. It's actually recommended to do this tabreed, the waiting for the time to cool down a bit. If it's in the winter, they say it's recommended to pray dhuhr straight away. Why? Because in winter, remember, there's a very short window between dhuhr and asr. You don't want to pray dhuhr at the later period and risk missing it and waiting until the entering of asr. So pray dhuhr as soon as it comes in the winter, ideally, but you can pray it a little while later when it's hot outside. But what about us? You know, if you're at home or at work and it's summertime or wintertime, it's kind of all the same, right? Does that mean you should wait or just pray straight away? Use your own discretion. But if you need to wait for some reason, if you're hot or it's the middle of the day, you know, some people have really cold houses with the ACs blasting and others don't. So it all depends on the person. What about Asr? It's recommended to delay the Asr a bit, but not so long that the sun changes. And what they mean by that is you shouldn't delay the Asr to the point where you can look at the sun without damaging your eyes. You know, when the sun is so low on the horizon that you can actually look at it without it damaging your eyes. I don't mean staring for 20 minutes. I mean just looking at it casually. You can observe it. When the sun has gone down that far to the point where you can look at it, you shouldn't wait to pray Asr at that time. You should have prayed it before. But you can delay it a little bit, just not that long. So, to delay it to the point where the sun is observable like that is makruh tahrimi. It's prohibitively disliked. So it's sinful to delay it that far because there's a great risk of missing the Asr altogether. Now we come to Maghrib. When is the recommended mustahab time to pray Maghrib? Now, before I answer this, let me ask you, most of you are from the subcontinent, what happens in the masajid after the adhan of Maghrib? How long do they wait? They don't wait. They wait in... No, not here. I'm saying those of you from India or Pakistan, from the Hanafi, ma wara an-nahar, they don't pray sunnahs. As soon as the adhan is done, it's the iqamah. That's because in the school of Imam Abu Hanifa, it is recommended to pray it immediately. We don't do that, do we? We have a 10-minute gap because we take into consideration the diversity of fiqh views, and we give people time to come to the masjid, get inside, get situated. So 10 minutes is it's a good window. It's not too long. What? Do you want to go back to 5 minutes? Oh, yeah. It's good. It's good. Yeah, it does. It does work out well in Ramadan because it's kind of hard to get up for the iqamah when you're still chewing the date, right? So we have some flexibility here, but again, it's recommended. It's not haram to delay it a bit to take care of these needs. It's just recommended according to the school of Imam Abu Hanifa. Now, they also mention the issue of cloudy weather, and this is really pertinent to us. In the school of Imam Abu Hanifa, they say that in cloudy weather, you should pray Asr and Isha as soon as the time enters. And for the other prayers, so Fajr, Dhuhr, and Maghrib, in cloudy weather, you should delay them somewhat. So let's say it's an average rainy, cloudy Pittsburgh day, and you don't have your prayer calculator. You're outside. It's Fajr. You should delay it a bit. Dhuhr, you should delay it a little bit. Asr, it's recommended to pray it straight away. Maghrib, delay it a little bit. Isha, pray it straight away. Why? Because they say that you want to ensure that the times have truly entered. If it's cloudy, you can't see the sun. How do you know it's Maghrib? Right? But if it's Asr, you have a pretty good idea it's Asr. You've prayed Dhuhr, you have some flexibility there. Same thing for Fajr, you don't know. Delay it a little bit. So this is recommended. Now, is this applicable to us with the calculators, the apps on the phone? Not really. But if you're out and about, it may come in handy that you remember it's better to be sure that the prayer time has come in rather than to assume it has because you're in the general time frame. All right. So that's really it. We just want to cover a couple of points about when you shouldn't be praying. When should you not be praying? The fuqaha mentioned that there are 3 times where if there was a prayer that was obligatory before that time, it's invalid to pray it in this time. So, sunrise, which is basically when the sun has risen, until the sun is about 1 or 2 spear lengths above the horizon. So 3 meters, give or take, 3 to 6 meters. So if you have the shuruq time, right, that time is after the sun has risen above the horizon. That would be a time where you can pray. So after Fajr, you shouldn't be praying. But when it's the actual rising of the sun, that's a prohibited time, because this is a tashabbuh bil mushrikeen, a resemblance of the acts of certain groups of idol worshippers who would offer prayers to the sun salutation, right? That's the kind of prayer that some groups of Hindus and others do. Another prohibited time is midday. When is midday? It's when the shadow of the object stops shortening, but before it starts to lengthen. So basically, if you have the stick in the ground and you observe the shadow stops moving and it hasn't started lengthening, there's a period right there where it's haram to pray. How long is that? It's about 7 to 10 minutes. And you should do this as a homework assignment. Take a stick, put it outside, observe the shadow grow shorter, observe it as it stops, and consider how long it takes before it starts to move again, to grow. That period of time is when the sun is at the zenith. It's about 7 to 10 minutes depending on your location. That's a prohibited time. This means that if you, let's say you come to the masjid for something and it's 12:30, it seems like midday, doesn't it? Can you pray at that time? Yes or no? Well, it depends on when dhuhr is, right? Because we're now going back to our default, which is the prayer app. Well, in my mind, it's let's say 1:30. So if it's 1:30, that means that the sun will be at the zenith at probably 1:20. At 1:20, it's at the zenith, and maybe at around 1:30, that's when you have it in dhuhr time, that position. So if you're coming at 12:20, it feels like the midday because it's 12:20, but you haven't yet entered a prohibited time. So it's not based on 12:30, it seems like midday. It's based on the actual position of the sun, because we're so connected to the apps and we're so disconnected from observing the sun, we may think that it's prohibited when in fact it's okay. So you have to be mindful of this. So that's the second time in which it's haram to pray. The third time is sunset. So sunset is when the sun is moving down below the horizon. The only exception to that, the fuqaha say, is the asr of that day, which means if a person missed asr from the day before, you can't pray qada during these prohibited times. You pray the qada, the makeup, after these times or before them. But on this last one, at sunset, it's prohibited to pray unless it is the asr of that day. So let's say it's sunset. The sun, the disk is on the tip of the horizon and it's dipping below. You still see a bit of the sun. That's a prohibited time to pray. But if you didn't pray asr of that day, you go and pray it, even though it's sinful to pray it at that time because you've delayed it to a prohibited time. You still pray that. And when is that happening? Depending on where we are, it's about 15 or so minutes before Maghrib. So if you are stuck in traffic and you didn't pray Asr and you see that Maghrib is at 8:40 and you're driving and it's 8:20, you're in the danger zone. That means you have maybe 5 minutes before you're in the haram. So get out of the car and go pray somewhere. Or better yet, make sure you're praying it in the ideal time and not pushing it past. We don't want to fall into this habit of thinking that, okay, Dhuhr enters at 1:30, Asr enters at 5:30, so I have a few hours, I'll pray it at 5. Even if technically you call Dhuhr and Dhuhr time, it's a bad habit because it's only a matter of time before you end up delaying it until the Asr enters. Or to say, Asr comes in at 5:30, Maghrib is at 8:40, I'll pray it closer to 8:50. No, you're really pushing it. So we're not pushing the prayers to the least optimal time. If you have to choose between praying it at the last time or the earliest, go with the earliest. It's the safest thing to do. Okay. There's other times where it's disliked to pray voluntary prayers, and we'll be ending with this. It's disliked to pray voluntary prayers. Sunrise, midday, sunset, during a khutbah, when the Imam appears or stands up, until after the prayer is completed. You'll see sometimes people doing this. As the khatib, I see lots of things that others don't see, because they're standing and facing the khatib, and I'm observing all sorts of stuff. People just decide, and I've seen this many times, they decide in the middle of the khutbah, they get up and pray 2 rak'ahs. Right? That's different from praying tahiyyatul masjid, the greeting of the masjid. There's a difference of opinion about that between the schools. Some say if the Imam has stood up and is giving the khutbah, you just sit down. Others say no, you pray those 2 rak'ahs. And to give you a little anecdote, I once came into a masjid in Mauritania right after the adhan for Jumu'ah. I was a bit late, and I prayed the 2 rak'ahs of Tahiyyatul Masjid, and I wasn't going really slow, but by the time I gave my taslim, it was the iqamah for the salat. That's how short the khutbah was. Yeah. So it's disliked to be praying anytime during the khutbah. It's disliked also to pray sunnahs before Fajr, except the sunnah of Fajr. And it's disliked to be praying sunnahs after Fajr, and disliked to pray them after Asr until sunset. Now, for the times between the true dawn and sunrise, and between Asr and the dimming of the sun before sunset, you can do qada, make-up prayers, just not these open-ended voluntary prayers. So these details are easy to forget. That's why it's good to review these from time to time to refresh our memories, so that we are aware of our obligations. And as I said in the beginning, we probably won't have to deal too much with the measurement of shadows from salat, from objects that are upright, but it's good to connect the prayer times to the movement of the sun, so that we see the actual causes of the obligation and not the secondary means by which those causes are communicated to us. The prayer calendar, calculator app going off is not the cause for the obligation of the prayer. It is communicating a calculation of the actual cause, which is the entering of the time measured by these movements of the sun. Our months are measured by the moon, and our salawat are measured by the sun. And my homework for all of you is just an exercise. Go out, get a stick or some solid object, plant it upright in the ground at around 1 o'clock, and observe it, and wait until Dhuhr comes, and then see later, close to Asr, how long it is, and compare that to your prayer calculator. See if there's any discrepancy between the way you calculate with the object and the shadow and what's appearing on your phone. Don't be surprised if it's off a little bit. And this is why, if you find that it's off, default to delaying a little bit for these prayers, so that you know that they're in, right? Wallahu a'lam, wa sallallahu wa sallam ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. We have time for a couple of questions if there's any.
I have a few questions. So you mentioned that you can follow the Hanafi opinion during the winter times. And it's especially helpful for the kids who are in school who want to go back and pray. So my question is that once you start following that, do you stick to that, or are you allowed to change between standard or Hanafi?
So this is a question related to usul. Are you allowed to do talfiq, which is to basically mix and match different opinions from different schools or from within a single school? Can you do that preemptively or retroactively? There are some details, there are parameters, but what I've heard from my teachers is that you can do this retroactively. You can even do it preemptively based on need. You can do it. And you can go back to your asl, what you tend to do, because whether you are praying the earlier asr according to the position of the 3 madhahib, or you are praying the later asr time according to the view of Imam Abu Hanifah, in either case, you are following qualified scholarship. And if you follow one due to legitimate need, not just laziness, then you are obeying Allah in following the qualified scholarship. in that time of need. And I think it's really important to communicate this to our young ones, our children, who have to deal with the prayer times in school in the winter. This, for many of them, if not most, gives them a window whereby, depending on when they get home, they could be praying Dhuhr when they get home, right? Instead of risking missing Dhuhr or it conflicting with the schedule, and it becomes very difficult to pray while at school. But no, there's no harm in a person sticking to one the majority of the time and then going to the other for these legitimate needs. It's not a case of just following desires. It's really for a need of going to this view to facilitate obedience to Allah Ta'ala, not to just take the easy way out. Yeah.
I've heard that you can pray before, like a time, like if you, for instance, fall asleep and Asha still hasn't come from.
Yeah, so that's the issue of combining certain prayers. So, particularly combining Maghrib and Isha under certain circumstances. And we're going to get to that. There's a whole section detailing that later on when we talk about the prayer of the traveler, as well as the circumstances of joining the prayers and shortening the prayers. And we'll address that. It's not so simple as to say, oh, it's summer and I'm tired, I'm going to pray Isha and then go to bed. I'll pray Maghrib and then Isha right away and go to bed. It's not that simple. We'll get into it, inshallah, when we cover the travel and prayer. Yeah. You're traveling on an airplane? Yeah, we'll probably talk about that in the traveling section. Although I'll give you an anecdote. I was in Seattle, Washington, far west coast, and I was catching a flight back to Morocco. I boarded the plane at 10 in the morning. I'm flying, and I don't even know what time it is anymore, but it was a Saturday, 10 in the morning. I arrive in France on Sunday at, I believe it was Dhuhr time. I was so confused because apparently I've missed Dhuhr, Asr, Maghrib, Isha, and Fajr, and I'm currently in France at Dhuhr time, waiting to get a connecting flight to Morocco with no time to really pray. And so I board the flight to Morocco. I arrive at Morocco at Asr time with about 45 minutes to spare to catch the train to Fez in the airport. So I'm in the airport, Musalla, praying Dhuhr, Asr, Maghrib, Isha, Fajr, Dhuhr, Asr. I was so confused. So praying in airplanes can be a confusing affair. We'll talk about them with the travel, inshallah. Basically, the simple answer is you try to pray according to the time of place you're over, and you can use, I don't know what they call that, the screen where you can see where the plane is, and you can make some calculations. But you have to be very careful, because as soon as you close your eyes, next thing you know, it's dark or the sun is out, because you're traveling so quickly. But inshallah, you're ma'adhur, you're excused, because you're just trying your best to pray in the time, but it keeps fluctuating so quickly. Just do your best. Yeah. Khair inshallah. Sallallahu alaihi wa sallam ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.